"Your father is alive. I know you put him in the psychiatric hospital," shouted the housekeeper. Martha had never raised her voice inside that house. In 4 years of cleaning every nook and cranny of those gilded walls, she had learned to be invisible. But that Thursday morning, with the yellow gloves still on her hands and her heart pounding out of her chest, she pointed her finger at Grant Sterling and said what she knew, and what she knew was too big to stay silent about. It had all started 3 weeks earlier, on an afternoon of light rain that left the estate's garden with that smell of wet earth that Martha loved so much. She was finishing polishing the second-floor hallway when she heard Grant's voice coming from the office. The door was slightly open and she wasn't snooping. She swears she wasn't, but some words reached her with a clarity that couldn't be ignored. "The paperwork has already been signed. He won't be leaving that place anytime soon." Martha stopped. The cloth in her hand stayed frozen in the same spot on the floor. She waited 1 second, 2, 3. Grant kept talking more quietly, and she couldn't hear anything else. But that sentence stuck in her head like a splinter that won't come out. Because Mr. Arthur had gone to that clinic exactly 22 days earlier, and Martha, who had known that man since before Grant had moved back into the estate, couldn't understand why. Mr. Arthur Sterling was 72 years old, and he was a more lucid man than many people Martha knew who were half his age. She knew this not from hearsay, but because every morning, when she arrived for work, he was the one who opened the door. He was the one who asked how her son was doing, how the previous day had been, whether the rain had stopped in time so she wouldn't get soaked. He was the one who left a cup of strong black coffee on the kitchen counter before she started her shift, just because one day she had mentioned she liked strong black coffee without sugar. These small details say a lot about a person, and Mr. Arthur was made of details like that. Grant, on the other hand, had arrived at the estate 7 months earlier, coming from a big city where he had tried to start a business that didn't work out. He was the old man's only son, and Mr. Arthur had welcomed the young man with open arms. Martha remembered the day the father had shown the rooms to his son as if it were the first time, proud of every detail of the house he had built over decades. But something had changed far too quickly. In less than a month, Grant started bringing a woman named Tiffany over for dinner, then for the weekend. Then Tiffany was there every day, bossing the staff around with a familiarity no one had asked her to have. And Mr. Arthur, who had always been the master of the house, grew quiet. He withdrew. He took up less and less space in that place that was his. Martha had noticed. Mrs. Hattie, who had worked in the kitchen for 16 years, had noticed too. But the two of them had stayed in their place because a hired hand who talks too much doesn't last long at a good job. Then Mr. Arthur had a bad night. He woke up confused, didn't know where he was, called out the name of a woman Martha had never known. The next day, Grant called a doctor. The following week, he called another. 2 weeks later, Mr. Arthur had been taken to Willow Creek Manor in a neighboring town, and Grant was signing paperwork in the office with a haste that didn't match the sadness he pretended to have on his face. Look, when I found out about this part, I had to stop for a second, because I know that dynamic from afar. I know it from my own family, and it hurts in a way that doesn't have an easy name. Martha tried not to think about it too much. She tried to keep working normally. But then came that rainy day, and that sentence she heard through the slightly open door, and the splinter that stayed in her head never came out again. It was Mrs. Hattie who planted the first real seed. One afternoon, when the two of them were alone in the kitchen, the older woman rested her hands on the sink and said in a low voice, without looking at Martha, "You know Mr. Arthur called me." Martha turned her face away. "Called from where?" "From Willow Creek Manor. He's known my cell number by heart for who knows how long. He called me last night at 10 o'clock. Said he's fine, that he's lucid, that he wants to come home." Mrs. Hattie paused. "And said he didn't sign anything, that the commitment was decided without him." Martha felt her stomach tighten. "This is serious, Mrs. Hattie. I know it's serious. That's why I'm telling you." The two of them looked at each other for a while. Outside, the rain fell slowly on the garden leaves. Inside that kitchen, full of years and silence, something had changed between them. It was no longer just two employees exchanging words. It was two women who were seeing something wrong happening and needed to decide what they were going to do about it. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. The problem was that Martha didn't have anything concrete. A phrase overheard by accident and the account of a late-night phone call weren't proof of anything. Grant could simply say that his father was confused, that was exactly why he needed care, and no one would be able to argue. But Martha started paying closer attention. She noticed that Grant spent long hours in his father's office, going through folders that used to stay locked. She noticed that Tiffany had started referring to the estate as our house in conversations with the friends who came to visit her. She noticed that a painting that hung in the living room, an oil portrait of Grant's mother, had been taken off the wall and put in a corner of the storage room, as if it were an old thing getting in the way of the new decor Tiffany wanted. That portrait. Martha had cleaned that painting hundreds of times. She knew every detail of the woman's face painted there. The steady gaze, the white hair, the posture of someone who had lived a lot and wasn't afraid of anything. That was Mrs. Eleanor, who had passed away 15 years before, and whose face Mr. Arthur had never let leave that room all that time. Taking that painting off the wall without anyone's permission was a small thing, but small things say a lot when you're paying attention. It was on a Wednesday morning that Martha found the document. She was cleaning the office, a task she did every week, careful not to move anything out of place. Grant had left early, and Tiffany was still asleep. Martha was wiping down the desk when she saw a folded sheet that had fallen behind an open drawer. She picked it up to put it back on the desk and, without meaning to, saw what was written. It was a report from a clinic. Mr. Arthur's name was there, and on a line near the end, written with a clarity that left no doubt, was the evaluation of the doctor responsible for the commitment. Patient demonstrates full orientation to time and place, presents no condition that justifies involuntary commitment at this time. Martha stood still, holding that sheet. The document had a date. It was from the previous week. Grant had that stored in his office and hadn't done anything. She put the paper back where she had found it, finished the cleaning, and left that room with her heart in her throat. That night she couldn't sleep properly. She lay in bed thinking about what to do, who to talk to, how to talk. She was a maid. Grant was the owner's son. Any word she said could be twisted around, and she would be the one to lose. But Mr. Arthur was in a facility, without needing to be, and no one seemed to be doing anything to change that. There are things you hear and feel like you know that pain from somewhere. Martha was afraid, but there was something stronger than fear inside her at that moment. The next morning she arrived at the estate and found Grant in the main room, wearing a dark suit, dressed as if he were going to an important meeting. He was looking at the empty spot on the wall where Mrs. Eleanor's portrait had hung for so many years. Martha set the bucket on the floor, straightened her yellow gloves, and then, before the part of her that was afraid could speak louder, she said, "Mr. Grant, I need to talk to you." He turned his face with that look of someone merely tolerating her. "What is it, Martha?" And that's when she spoke. Not all at once, not in an organized way, but she kept talking. About the document she had seen by accident, about the call to Mrs. Hattie, about the sentence she had heard through the door, about everything she had kept inside her over the past few weeks. Grant listened with a stony expression. When she finished, he said with a calm that was worse than shouting, "You went through my things. I didn't go through them. The paper had fallen behind the drawer. You had no business reading any document. Mr. Grant, the report says your father doesn't need to be there. The report was made by a doctor who hasn't known my father long enough. I have other reports." Martha took a deep breath. "But you haven't shown that report to anyone. You haven't talked to anyone else in the family. You didn't even notify Mrs. Hattie, who has been with Mr. Arthur for 16 years. Grant took a step toward her. "Martha, you work here, I respect that, but my family is none of your business." And that's when something inside her broke, not the way it breaks when you walk away defeated, the way it breaks when you stop being afraid. She pointed her gloved finger at him and said loudly, with a voice she didn't recognize as her own, "Your father is alive. He is lucid, and I know you put him in the psychiatric hospital without needing to." The silence that came after that was different from any silence Martha had experienced in that house. Grant stood still. At the far end of the room, the empty spot on the wall where the portrait had hung seemed even heavier than before, as if the absence of that woman painted in oil were listening to everything. "You just quit," he said slowly. "You can fire me." Martha didn't lower her finger. "But before that, you're going to listen to me. Because I'm not the only one who knows, and what I know isn't going to stay with me alone." Grant opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time since he had arrived at that estate, he seemed not to know what to say. Martha had spent that sleepless night doing something Grant didn't know about. She had called Mr. Arthur's niece, a woman named Diane who lived in Miami, a few hours from there. Diane was the daughter of the old man's older sister, and the two families had drifted apart over the years. But Martha had her number because Mr. Arthur sometimes asked her to call to pass along birthday dates and things like that. Diane answered on the second ring, and when Martha told her what she knew, the woman was silent for a long time before saying, "I was already finding it strange. Grant sent me a message saying my uncle had asked not to receive visitors, but I didn't really believe that. He is lucid, Miss Diane. He called the house Cook. He wants to come home." "Oh my God." Diane's voice had changed. "And the documents for the house, for his assets." Martha didn't know how to answer that, but the question hung in the air like an answer in itself. Diane said she was going to take action. Martha didn't know exactly what that meant, but she slept a little more peacefully, knowing there was someone else on her side. But that morning, before Diane had done anything, Grant showed up in the room dressed in his suit, and Martha couldn't wait. Now the two of them stood there, facing each other, and the air between them was heavy in a way that couldn't be taken back. Grant turned, walked over to the window and stood looking out at the garden with his hands in his pockets. When he spoke again, his voice was different, lower, and there was something there that Martha didn't expect to find. It sounded like exhaustion. "You don't know anything about what my father went through these past few months. Then tell me." He turned his face to the side, not toward her, but toward some point between the two of them. He had 2 severe episodes. 2. We woke up in the middle of the night and he was in the garden, not knowing how he'd gotten there. He was calling for my mother as if she were right there beside him. His voice trembled slightly. "Do you know what it's like to see your father calling for someone who's been gone 15 years as if it were right now, as if everything that happened since then hadn't been real?" Martha stayed quiet. "I brought in a doctor. 2 doctors. Both said he needed observation, so I arranged for observation." He took a breath. "That report you saw is from a 3-week routine evaluation. It's not the final report. And yes, he's better now, but better in 3 weeks doesn't mean cured." There was logic in it. There was pain in it. And Martha felt the ground grow a little less firm beneath her feet. But there was still one thing that didn't add up. "And the portrait of Mrs. Eleanor? Why did you take it off the wall?" Grant was quiet for a while. "Tiffany asked to redecorate the living room, and you let her. It's my house." "Not yet." Martha said it before she could think, but she didn't take it back. "It's still your father's house." The silence returned, and this time it lasted longer. Grant turned his face and truly looked at her for the first time in that conversation, not with anger, with something Martha took a second to recognize. It was shame. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and above all subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. I had to take a deep breath here, because there's a huge difference between a son who does something wrong because he's bad and a son who does something wrong because he's lost. And sometimes it's harder to deal with the second kind. What happened in the following hours was slow and full of rough edges, as everything real usually is. Diane arrived that afternoon, not alone. She came with her husband and an older cousin named Mildred, a white-haired woman with a determined expression whom Martha had never seen before, but who walked through the door of the estate as if she knew every inch of the place. Mildred had been a friend of Mrs. Eleanor's. She had frequented that house for decades, and upon seeing the empty spot on the wall where the portrait used to hang, She stopped in the middle of the living room and stood staring at it for a good long while without saying anything. Grant received the three of them with a mix of surprise and defensiveness. Tiffany, who had come down for lunch, stood beside him with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. Diane was direct. "I want to talk to my uncle." "My father is resting at Willow Creek Manor," Grant replied. "I know where he is. I want to go visit him today." "Visits need to be scheduled in advance." "Then schedule it now." There was a force in Diane's voice that didn't argue. Grant looked at Tiffany, then at his cousin, then at Mildred, who was still standing there looking at the empty wall. Something in that older woman's gaze seemed to bother him in a way he couldn't name. "I can call the clinic," he said at last. "Please." Martha was in the hallway, listening to all of it from a distance, her heart racing. Mrs. Hattie appeared beside her, drying her hands on her apron, and the two of them stood there together, without needing to say anything. The call was made. The visit was scheduled for the next day, but that afternoon still held a surprise. Mildred, after remaining silent for a long time, went to the hallway where Martha was, and looked her up and down with those clear, serious eyes. "You're the one who tipped off Diane?" "Yes, that was me." The old woman stayed quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Arthur told me about you once. Said there was a young woman working here who knew how to listen." She paused. "He said that was rare." Martha couldn't manage a reply. That tightness in her chest caught her off guard. Mildred went on, "Did you know he was trying to call me too? The number here doesn't go through to Willow Creek Manor, but he tried." Mrs. Hattie took his call. "I know, she told me this morning." The old woman looked at the hallway wall, where other pictures hung, old family photographs. "Arthur built all of this, every piece of this estate. He deserves to spend whatever years he has left in here with the people he chose to have close." Martha nodded. "And Grant." Mildred paused, heavy. "Grant is a boy who lost his mother too early and never learned how to stay in one place. That doesn't excuse him, but it explains some things." It was the first time anyone in that family had said something like that about Grant out loud. And the honesty of those words made Martha understand that Mildred wasn't there to take a side. She was there to do what was right. The visit happened the next day, as scheduled. Diane, Mildred, and Diane's husband went to Willow Creek Manor. Martha didn't go because she wasn't family, but Mrs. Hattie was called by Diane to serve as a long-time witness to Mr. Arthur's mental state. And when they came back in the afternoon, Martha was waiting in the kitchen. Mrs. Hattie's face said everything before she even opened her mouth. "He's doing great," the cook said, her voice full of an emotion she could barely contain. "He recognized me right away, asked if I'd brought the apple pie he asked for last week." She laughed, but her eyes were welling up. "Asked if Martha was doing okay?" Martha had to turn her face away. Diane came into the kitchen shortly after and closed the door. "The doctor in charge at Willow Creek Manor confirmed what was in the report you saw. My uncle is fit to be discharged. The episodes he had before can be monitored at home with follow-up care. There's no need for continued hospitalization." She took a breath. "I talked to Grant early this morning. He listened. It wasn't easy, but he listened." "And Tiffany?" Martha asked. Diane made a face that was almost a tired smile. "Tiffany is going to have to understand that this house isn't hers yet, and maybe it never will be, depending on what Uncle Arthur decides about his assets when he comes back." There was still a lot to be sorted out. Martha knew that, but something had shifted. Grant called Martha that afternoon. She went to the office expecting to be fired, bag in hand and head held high, but he wasn't standing like before. He was sitting behind his father's desk with the look of someone who had spent the night wrestling with himself. "I'm not going to fire you," he said. Martha said nothing. "What you did was an invasion of privacy. But I heard what you said, about the portrait, about the house." He looked around as if seeing the office from another angle for the first time. "Tiffany and I are going to talk about some things. You don't have to explain any of that to me, Mr. Grant." "I know I don't." He looked at her. "But I want you to know that I didn't want my father to suffer. I'm bad at that, at knowing what's right to do when everything is complicated." Martha stood still for a moment. Then she said, "Most people are bad at that." He nodded slowly. But there's a difference between being bad at making a decision and being able to revisit it when someone points out the mistake. She paused. You can still see her again, sir. Grant kept looking at her for a while. Then he said, My mother's portrait is going back on the wall. They were just words. But sometimes it's through the small things that we recognize a real change. Mr. Arthur came home 12 days later. Martha was there when the car stopped in front of the estate. He got out slowly, with that bearing of someone who has the years in his body but not in his head, looked at the front of the house as if he were seeing a beloved face again after a long time, and smiled. Mrs. Hattie was the first to reach him. The two embraced right there at the entrance, and the cook couldn't hold back her tears, and Mr. Arthur let out a tender little chuckle and said, Oh, Hattie, I'm perfectly fine. Stop crying. Diane was there. Mildred was there. Grant was, too, standing a little apart, hands clasped in front of him, waiting. And when the father entered the house and reached the main living room, the first thing he did was stop in front of the wall where Mrs. Eleanor's portrait had taken its place once again. He stood there for a long while without saying anything. No one said anything. None of us needed to say anything. Then Mr. Arthur turned and searched for Martha with his eyes. She was near the door, still in her uniform, yellow gloves in her hand because she hadn't had time to change clothes. Martha, he called. She went to him. Mrs. Hattie told me what you did. She didn't know what to say to that, so she stayed quiet. Thank you, he said simply. It was just one word, but the way he said it, with all that life inside those tired yet whole eyes, it was worth far more than that. Grant approached his father that afternoon. The two of them stayed in the living room for almost 2 hours with the door closed. Martha doesn't know what was said in there. No one knows. But when Grant came out, he had a different face. Not resolved, because some things don't get resolved in an afternoon, but different. Tiffany left the following weekend. Martha learned of it through Mrs. Hattie. No details, no drama, just that she had gone and taken her suitcases. Grant stayed, but he stayed in a different way. Quieter, more present, as if he were learning to take up space in the house without needing to take over the space of others. Martha kept working at the estate. She kept arriving in the morning, kept finding the coffee on the counter, because Mr. Arthur went back to that habit as soon as he got home. And one afternoon, when she was polishing the hallway on the second floor, the old man appeared with 2 glasses of orange juice and said, How about we sit for a bit? They sat on the steps of the wide staircase like 2 ordinary neighbors and chatted about nothing important for half an hour. About the garden, about the overcast weather, about a bird that had made a nest in one of the front windows. It was little, it was simple, it was exactly the kind of thing that doesn't show up in any document, any report, any signed paper. But it was real. And it was enough. End of the story. Sometimes we don't need grand gestures to make a difference in someone's life. Sometimes all it takes is not pretending you didn't see, not pretending you didn't hear, having the courage to say out loud what everyone was thinking in silence. Martha was an ordinary woman with a simple job, and she changed the course of an entire family just because she refused to be invisible at the most important moment. If this story touched you in any way, leave what you thought here in the comments. Do you think she did the right thing in standing up to Grant like that? Tell us where you're watching from. I love reading every single message from you all. A big hug, thank you so much for the company, and don't forget, leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.